Long before the rise of Babylon and the towering ziggurats that reached toward the heavens, there existed a civilization whose memory still echoes through fragments of clay tablets buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, perhaps the first urban people in human history, chronicled not only the growth of their cities and the lives of their kings, but also a world guided by beings far beyond human comprehension. These beings, known in the cuneiform texts as the Anunnaki, were described as divine arbiters, rulers of destiny, and custodians of earthly order. Yet within the oldest texts lies a series of hidden lines, overlooked by generations of scholars, that hint at a time when these rulers, so mighty and omnipresent, began to lose their grip on the planet they once controlled. The story of that loss, of rebellion and miscalculation, is shrouded in both myth and memory, written in symbols that have survived millennia, waiting for a careful eye to decipher their true meaning. It is a tale that challenges everything we understand about power, control, and the fragile balance between the divine and the mortal. The arrival of the Anunnaki. In the earliest layers of Sumerian literature, the Anunnaki are portrayed as sky-born entities, descending to Earth to establish order and governance over a world that teetered between chaos and potential. They were credited with the creation of cities, the introduction of agriculture, and the establishment of laws that would govern human society for centuries. Yet, embedded within the hymns and royal inscriptions are cryptic references to moments of hesitation, disputes among these celestial figures, and strange annotations that suggest they were not entirely omnipotent. Their authority, though revered, was not absolute. Each tablet, painstakingly etched into clay, reveals a hierarchy where power was shared, contested, and sometimes threatened by forces even they could not fully command. This subtle fragility, barely perceptible to casual readers, hints at an underlying vulnerability in the structure of their dominion, a flaw that would later manifest in dramatic and irreversible ways. The creation myths provide further insight into the Anunnaki's motives. They were not merely creators, but also managers, overseeing labor and resources, particularly in the early development of human beings. Humans were said to be fashioned from a combination of clay and divine essence, created to serve the labor needs of these celestial rulers. However, some passages, long dismissed as metaphor, describe a growing impatience among the Anunnaki themselves. The work of shaping civilizations, of directing rivers, of designing intricate irrigation networks, was described as burdensome. And in these frustrations, historians now suspect hints of dissent, disagreements that were subtle at first, but would grow into profound fractures in their governance. Within the city of Eridu, considered by Sumerians as the first city ever built, the texts describe a council of Anunnaki leaders. Their deliberations, recorded in fragmented tablets, reveal disputes over human obedience, resource allocation, and the increasing independence of the beings they had created. Some lines suggest that not all Anunnaki agreed on how much influence they should exert over human societies, with a faction advocating for direct control and another favoring guidance from a distance. This ideological division, barely perceptible in standard translations, would become the first crack in what had been perceived as an unshakable reign. The presence of the Anunnaki in human affairs is often portrayed as benevolent, but a closer reading exposes a more complex relationship. Their decrees often brought both prosperity and conflict. For example, while introducing agriculture led to surpluses and growth, it also created competition among human communities and tensions over water rights, land distribution, and social hierarchies. The Anunnaki were forced to mediate disputes among humans, an ironic twist for beings who had arrived as masters. In these interventions, they inadvertently sowed seeds of instability, a theme that recurs in the hidden lines of the tablets, revealing that control was never as complete as the myths suggested. Evidence from the Eridu Genesis further supports this interpretation. The text, often overshadowed by the more famous Epic of Gilgamesh, contains passages describing divine assemblies reacting to human rebellion with both anger and bewilderment. The terminology used in these passages, words that translate roughly to confounded, unable to intervene fully, and uncertain in purpose, indicates a period when the Anunnaki were not acting in unison. This division is crucial, as it shows that the divine hierarchy was vulnerable to internal disagreement, undermining the very foundation of their earthly authority. Archaeological excavations in southern Mesopotamia, where these texts were first discovered, provide physical context to the narratives. The layout of early Sumerian cities, their monumental structures, and advanced irrigation systems imply meticulous planning, yet also suggest layers of experimentation and adjustment. Scholars increasingly recognize that these adaptations may reflect not only human innovation, but also the unseen hand of Anunnaki oversight, struggling to maintain control over a dynamic and unpredictable environment. Hidden annotations, small corrections in the tablets, may reflect moments of divine re-evaluation, subtle evidence of a leadership grappling with the unexpected consequences of its own creations. The Anunnaki were not immortal in the sense humans imagine. They were bound by laws of their own cosmic design. These limitations are referenced obliquely in hymns praising the gods' timely judgment and measured interventions. Such phrasing implies that while they were powerful, their ability to manipulate events was governed by rules they themselves could not fully override. These constraints created opportunities for human initiative, rebellion, and adaptation, which over centuries would erode the perception of Anunnaki omnipotence. Interestingly, some tablets hint at alliances with other, lesser-known divine entities. These alliances were often fragile, dictated by necessity rather than loyalty. As disputes among the Anunnaki intensified, these external entities appear to have exploited moments of indecision, further weakening centralized control. The narrative embedded within the text, often overlooked in conventional translations, paints a picture of a complex political landscape where even gods had to navigate diplomacy, strategy, and compromise. By the end of the earliest period described in the Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki's presence on Earth was already marked by tension. Their initial goals of orderly governance and human stewardship were undermined by internal division, unforeseen consequences of their interventions, and the unpredictable rise of the very humans they sought to control. The stage was set for a profound shift, one that would culminate in a day remembered not for conquest, but for the unraveling of celestial authority. The first signs of rebellion. Beneath the intricate carvings of Sumerian tablets, there exists a quiet tension, almost imperceptible to those unfamiliar with the nuances of cuneiform. These lines, often glossed over as repetitions of ritual praise, hide references to human initiative that defied the dictates of the Anunnaki. The texts describe moments when the humans they had shaped began to question, to act independently, and to innovate beyond the instructions of their divine overseers. In some passages, humans are described as finding ways unseen and moving against the pattern of the divine plan. Such wording implies a subtle but growing resistance, a rebellion not of violence, but of intellect and creativity, emerging in the shadow of celestial authority. Early settlements in Sumer were tightly controlled, yet archaeological evidence suggests that these communities were experimenting with technology and agriculture in ways that the Anunnaki may not have anticipated. Irrigation canals, levees, and granaries were built with remarkable ingenuity, often deviating from the standardized methods attributed to divine guidance. The hidden lines in the texts suggest that these deviations were observed with concern by the Anunnaki. Phrases translating roughly to "the work is done without the eye of the Lord" appear sporadically, hinting at actions taken outside of the expected chain of command, a first sign that control was slipping. The concept of rebellion was not merely practical, it was symbolic. Certain hymns, often interpreted as prayers to the gods, contain cryptic allusions to humans asserting their will. Phrases like "they bend the path of the heavens" or "they reach beyond the shadow of the lords" are often dismissed as poetic flourishes. Yet scholars now suggest these lines encode a narrative of human audacity, documenting moments when people acted in defiance of their celestial creator's expectations. This is particularly evident in texts associated with city-states like Uruk and Lagash, where records indicate organized innovation and independent governance emerging alongside divine decrees. One striking element is the tension within the Anunnaki themselves. The texts reveal disagreement about how to respond to human autonomy. Some factions advocated strict intervention, enforcing obedience through punishment or restriction, while others argued for a more lenient approach, allowing humans to experiment and learn. These internal divisions were noted in lines that translate to expressions such as "the council is torn" or "voices of dissent among the watchers." This disunity weakened their influence and provided the first real openings for humans to assert themselves, sowing seeds for eventual defiance that the Anunnaki could neither predict nor fully control. Artifacts and temple records hint at symbolic resistance as well. Early depictions of humans building structures without ritual oversight, conducting ceremonies independent of Anunnaki approval, and establishing trade networks that bypassed divine sanction all point to a society quietly testing the limits of its creator's dominion. These acts, subtle and often ritualistic, are chronicled in the so-called administrative tablets, overlooked in early translations for their apparent mundane content. Yet the hidden subtext speaks to a people learning to operate within, and sometimes outside of, the boundaries set by the Anunnaki, signaling the beginnings of what would become a systematic challenge to divine authority. The tension was not solely intellectual or symbolic, it had economic and political dimensions as well. The Sumerians developed methods of resource allocation, taxation, and civic administration that operated parallel to the directives attributed to the Anunnaki. These systems, recorded in detailed account tablets, suggest humans were gradually creating self-sufficient networks that required minimal divine supervision. The text's hidden lines emphasize the growing capacity for organization, noting that they arrange the stores and keep the measure without command, revealing a remarkable early autonomy in logistics and governance. Religious practices themselves began to reflect these changes. Humans started to reinterpret the will of the gods, creating their own rituals and narratives that incorporated Anunnaki figures but placed humans at the center of agency. This subtle redirection of worship is evident in lines describing humans honoring the lords but moving their hearts elsewhere. While seemingly benign, these passages suggest that devotion was becoming selective, guided not only by divine instruction but by human choice. This shift challenged the traditional narrative of absolute divine control and introduced uncertainty into the Anunnaki's perception of loyalty and obedience. Evidence of direct confrontation, though rare, is also present. Certain mythic passages describe anger rising among the humans, or the measure of the watchers is tested. While these phrases have often been interpreted metaphorically, a closer reading indicates episodes in which humans directly resisted the mandates of their overseers, perhaps through acts of defiance in governance, labor, or ritual observance. These rebellions, though small in scale, demonstrate a growing consciousness among humanity, a recognition of power, and an emerging understanding that the Anunnaki's authority was not absolute. By the end of this period, the Sumerian texts suggest that the balance of power was shifting incrementally. Humans were becoming more than passive recipients of divine instruction. They were active participants, shaping their environment, institutions, and societies in ways the Anunnaki had not intended. The hidden lines, often obscured by damage to the tablets or mistranslation, reveal a narrative of quiet, persistent rebellion. It was the beginning of a slow unraveling, a subtle erosion of control that would, in time, culminate in a momentous confrontation between creator and creation, heralding a day when the Anunnaki would face the first tangible cracks in their dominion over Earth. Secrets of the hidden lines. Beneath the visible surface of the Sumerian tablets lie inscriptions that resist easy interpretation. These hidden lines, often abbreviated, damaged, or written in unusual cuneiform variants, contain the most tantalizing clues about the decline of Anunnaki authority. Scholars have long overlooked them, dismissing irregularities as errors or scribal idiosyncrasies. Yet, closer examination reveals intentional subtleties. Cryptic references to shadows crossing the path of the lords, or the measures undone by those below, suggest moments when humans acted contrary to divine expectations. Such passages, though brief, hint at a world in which the apparent omnipotence of the Anunnaki was undermined by forces within the very civilizations they governed. These hidden lines are often concentrated in texts concerned with administration and ritual, areas where the Anunnaki sought to impose rigid order. Account tablets, detailing grain distribution or labor assignments, sometimes contain annotations indicating actions that diverged from expected practice. Words that translate roughly to without counsel, unexpectedly, or beyond decree pepper these tablets, implying that humans were finding ways to circumvent divine oversight. These deviations were not chaotic. They were carefully calculated, suggesting that the earliest signs of rebellion were informed by strategy and foresight, rather than mere impulsive behavior. One of the most intriguing aspects of the hidden lines is their depiction of internal discord among the Anunnaki themselves. Passages hint at councils where leaders disagreed over responses to human initiative. Some advocated direct intervention, while others advised patience, noting that human ingenuity could serve their purposes if guided rather than suppressed. The texts record phrases such as "the voices clash in the great house" and "uncertainty holds the hand of the watchers," reflecting divisions in divine strategy that would ultimately weaken their ability to enforce control. These subtle fractures reveal that the loss of authority was as much internal as it was imposed by human action. Linguistic analysis of these cryptic lines shows intentional layering, with certain words repeated in ways that create multiple interpretations. For example, a single term might simultaneously suggest obedience, deception, and cleverness, implying a duality in human behavior that the Anunnaki struggled to manage. These linguistic subtleties indicate a sophisticated understanding by the Sumerians of the limitations of power and the complexity of free will. They document a world in which humans were not merely passive recipients of divine command, but participants capable of subverting it through intellect, collaboration, and foresight. Historical patterns corroborate these textual insights. Early city-states, like and Nippur, expanded their influence independently, constructing monumental architecture, codifying laws, and regulating resources with minimal divine intervention. The texts imply that the Anunnaki's authority over these practical matters was already waning, as humans increasingly assumed responsibility for systems the gods had originally imposed. In this light, the hidden lines serve as both record and warning. They chronicle a moment when control shifted incrementally, a shift imperceptible to casual observers, but evident to those attuned to the nuances of Sumerian writing. Beyond administration, the hidden lines reveal moments of moral and ethical tension. Humans were not only acting independently, they were redefining what obedience, loyalty, and justice meant within a world still nominally governed by divine beings. Some passages describe humans weighing the hearts of the lords, or choosing paths unbidden, suggesting that even values once dictated by the Anunnaki could be contested and reinterpreted. These lines indicate that the loss of control was not merely operational, it was existential, challenging the very legitimacy of divine oversight and introducing uncertainty into the cosmic order the Anunnaki had sought to impose. Inscriptions also point to moments when humans exploited gaps in Anunnaki oversight. Certain tablets describe events that occur beyond the gaze of the watchers, implying intentional action in areas where divine attention was minimal. This reflects not only growing initiative, but also the realization that the omnipresence of the Anunnaki was imperfect. As humans learned to act in these gaps, the celestial rulers faced the uncomfortable recognition that their control could be circumvented, that even beings of immense power were vulnerable to oversight failures, miscalculation, and human ingenuity. The hidden lines further suggest that some humans were aware of the weaknesses of the Anunnaki and may have deliberately tested them. Words that translate to "they stretch the cord without breaking" appear repeatedly, implying a careful exploration of limits, a recognition that resistance could be measured and calculated without inviting full divine reprisal. Such acts of subtle defiance, recorded almost as footnotes in administrative texts, mark a crucial turning point. Humans were beginning to comprehend the nature of divine authority and to navigate the fragments. The hidden lines speak to a gradual but profound shift in the perception of power. No longer were the Anunnaki depicted as infallible overlords. Instead, their decisions and decrees were subject to interpretation, negotiation, and circumvention. Humans were emerging as agents capable of reshaping their world, and even the most meticulous oversight of the Anunnaki could not fully contain this rise. By recording these nuances, the Sumerians left a subtle yet unmistakable testament to the day when the illusion of absolute control began to fracture, setting the stage for events that would reverberate across generations. The Day of Reckoning. The Sumerian texts record a day unlike any other, a moment when the Anunnaki's authority over Earth began to fracture in a way that could not be contained by ritual or decree. These tablets, fragmented and weathered by time, describe celestial assemblies called in haste, where the lords debated what had gone wrong with their designs. Humans, previously obedient or at least constrained, had begun acting in unison across multiple city-states, redirecting water flows, reallocating resources, and establishing social structures that ignored direct divine command. Lines in the texts suggest astonishment among the Anunnaki, using terms that translate roughly to "the pattern is broken" and "the measure falters," indicating the first explicit acknowledgement that control was slipping. During this period, humans displayed coordination that surprised even the Anunnaki. Trade networks expanded beyond the oversight of any singular divine agent, allowing cities to sustain themselves independently of the instructions once enforced from the heavens. The hidden lines describe humans moving with knowledge of the unseen and aligning the labor without watchers, emphasizing that the rebellion was not violent but intelligent, organized, and systematic. These passages imply a strategic understanding of the weaknesses in divine supervision, revealing a level of sophistication that the Anunnaki had neither anticipated nor prepared for. Religious texts of the time capture an extraordinary tension between obedience and innovation. Humans continue to honor the Anunnaki in ceremonial practice, yet the hidden lines indicate that the essence of worship had shifted, with rituals reflecting human priorities rather than divine instruction. Certain inscriptions suggest that priests and scribes began interpreting commands in ways that expanded human autonomy, allowing society to function efficiently while circumventing the strict oversight of the gods. The resulting ambiguity in authority destabilized the celestial order, creating an environment in which humans could test limits without immediate retribution. Some of the most revealing tablets are those describing labor management and agricultural planning. In these, humans appear to have taken unprecedented initiative, distributing resources according to local needs rather than central directives from the Anunnaki. Phrases that translate to "they decide the measure without decree" or "the stores are arranged beyond command" illustrate that divine oversight had gaps humans could exploit. This growing independence demonstrates that control was eroding in practical terms, as humans assumed responsibilities once enforced by the celestial hierarchy, establishing a form of governance that no longer relied on the gods' constant intervention. The Anunnaki's reactions, as recorded in fragments of mythic hymns, ranged from confusion to frustration. Some texts describe leaders convening councils, debating punitive action, or adjustment of labor protocols. Yet lines like "their council is divided, the heart unsettled" indicate a lack of unity in decision-making. Human ingenuity, paired with divine indecision, created a feedback loop in which every attempt to reassert control inadvertently revealed additional vulnerabilities. These moments, preserved in subtle annotations and marginalia, illustrate a celestial administration under strain, grappling with challenges of which they had little precedent. Conflict, though not overtly military, began to manifest in administrative disruptions. The texts describe instances in which humans refused to follow ceremonial labor schedules, rerouted irrigation systems, or reallocated grain storage according to local priorities. While these actions appear minor in isolation, the cumulative effect was significant. The hidden lines emphasize that such deviations were deliberate and coordinated, signaling that humans had learned to operate within the interstices of divine power, gradually constructing systems of resilience that diminished reliance on the Anunnaki. Even the natural world seemed to play a role in this shift. Floods, droughts, and the unpredictable cycles of rivers like the Euphrates and Tigris presented challenges that even the Anunnaki could not fully regulate. Hidden annotations note that humans responded to these environmental pressures with improvisation, adjusting canals, planting schedules, and storage techniques without awaiting divine guidance. These adaptive strategies further eroded the perception of unbroken celestial authority, suggesting that the Anunnaki's influence was increasingly contingent upon circumstances beyond their control. Observing the evolution of cities during this period provides further evidence of shifting power. Urban layouts became more complex and interdependent, with decentralized decision-making that reduced reliance on the directives of the Anunnaki. Inscriptions note humans choosing pathways of labor and building houses beyond the gaze of the lords, indicating an emergent autonomy in both physical and social organization. These developments reflect a subtle but profound transformation. Human societies were asserting control over their environment, and the Anunnaki were no longer the absolute arbiters of earthly order. Communication among humans also evolved in ways that the Anunnaki could not easily monitor. Trade, diplomacy, and administration relied increasingly on written records, symbols, and protocols that could bypass divine scrutiny. Hidden lines suggest humans were aware of their newfound agency, testing and expanding their influence while remaining within the nominal framework of obedience. By the end of this period, a pattern emerges in which the Anunnaki were forced to acknowledge that human capacity for organization and strategic planning exceeded what had once been imagined, and that a fundamental shift in power dynamics had occurred. The collapse of divine oversight. The hidden Sumerian texts reveal a moment when the Anunnaki, despite their immense power, were unable to maintain the level of control they once exercised over human societies. Fragments of administrative tablets describe cities functioning independently, with labor and resource allocation proceeding without explicit instruction from the gods. Phrases translating to "the measure moves apart from the decree" or "they act where the eye cannot follow" illustrate a practical loss of oversight, where humans were no longer strictly bound by the celestial hierarchy. This erosion of authority, subtle at first, accelerated as communities recognized that survival and growth depended increasingly on their own ingenuity rather than divine intervention. The collapse was compounded by internal divisions among the Anunnaki. The hidden lines in the texts describe councils in which leaders debated punitive measures, labor reassignments, and adjustments to ritual observance. Yet these debates reveal deep disagreements. Some advocated for intervention through direct oversight or punishment, while others advised restraint, warning that heavy-handed action could provoke further disruption. Phrases like "the hand is split, the council unclear," and "the watchers cannot act as one" underscore the difficulty the Anunnaki faced in enforcing unity, creating openings that humans were quick to exploit. Human societies, increasingly confident in their autonomy, began to innovate in ways that the Anunnaki had neither predicted nor desired. Irrigation systems were expanded and rerouted without divine approval. City walls were reinforced according to human initiative, and trade networks operated with minimal supervision. Certain texts note that humans adjust the river, move the grain, and place the labor where needed, with no reference to Anunnaki instruction. These passages indicate not rebellion in the sense of confrontation, but a deliberate assumption of responsibility, challenging the gods' monopoly on organization and governance. Religious practices evolved alongside administrative innovation. Humans continued to honor the Anunnaki, but began integrating local leaders and ancestral figures into worship, subtly shifting authority from celestial to terrestrial hands. Lines translating to "they bow yet choose their own path" and "they offer tribute but hold the measure themselves" suggest a redefinition of loyalty, one in which human agency was increasingly recognized within the spiritual framework. The hidden lines imply that the gods' influence was no longer absolute, and humans were shaping rituals to suit practical needs and societal cohesion. The texts also record moments of frustration among the Anunnaki, described with language emphasizing confusion and restraint. Words translating roughly to "the council falters" or "the lords cannot move the measure" indicate an inability to enforce their will effectively. These passages coincide with evidence of human coordination and planning that bypassed divine oversight. Humans were no longer acting only within the parameters established by the gods. They were testing limits, discovering loopholes, and using ingenuity to accomplish tasks previously managed by celestial decree. Environmental management further exposed gaps in divine control. The unpredictable cycles of rivers, seasonal flooding, and shifting soils required adaptive strategies which humans developed independently. Hidden lines describe actions such as "they guide the waters beyond instruction," or "they harvest where the eye does not see," illustrating the practical dimension of the collapse. Humans were no longer passive recipients of divine intervention. They were actively solving problems that had once required celestial guidance, creating resilience in the systems that had been intended to demonstrate dependence on the Anunnaki. Political and social structures began to reflect this growing autonomy. City-states exercised independent judgment in governance, trade, and legal matters. The hidden lines in legal texts indicate humans deciding penalties and rewards without counsel, and resolving disputes where the lords are absent, suggesting a transition to self-determination in social organization. These changes reveal a society increasingly capable of operating without direct divine supervision, indicating that the collapse of oversight was not temporary but systemic, affecting multiple layers of human life. Some inscriptions hint at direct challenges to Anunnaki authority. Though rarely violent, humans occasionally acted in ways that openly contradicted divine expectations. Tablets record phrases translating roughly to "the labor shifts against the word," or "the stores are placed contrary to the decree," suggesting deliberate choices made to assert agency. The hidden lines underscore the ingenuity with which humans managed resources, coordinated labor, and navigated social structures, highlighting that the collapse of oversight was as much intellectual and strategic as it was practical. By the period chronicled, the cumulative effect of human initiative, environmental challenges, and internal divisions among the Anunnaki had created a significant realignment of power. Humans were no longer merely participants in a divinely directed world. They were architects of their own society. The hidden lines of the Sumerian texts document this transformation, capturing the moment when the Anunnaki, despite their celestial authority, were compelled to recognize the emergence of independent human agency, rewriting the divine hierarchy. As human societies expanded and evolved, the Anunnaki were forced to confront the limitations of their authority. The Sumerian texts contain hidden lines describing councils of the gods in which leaders debated how to respond to the growing independence of humanity. Phrases translating to "the voices clash over the measure" and "the council divides in the great house" suggest that even beings of immense power struggled to maintain coherence. The Anunnaki's hierarchy, once presumed unshakable, was being challenged not only by human initiative, but also by internal discord, creating opportunities for humans to assert control in areas previously dominated by divine oversight. The reorganization of divine responsibilities is hinted at in administrative and ritual tablets. Certain Anunnaki were assigned oversight of specific regions, yet these assignments often conflicted with local human practices. Lines in the texts translate roughly to "the steward cannot follow the paths" and "the keeper's eye is turned aside," reflecting the inability of celestial agents to enforce compliance consistently. Humans began exploiting these gaps, establishing systems of governance, labor, and ritual that operated independently of divine supervision. The hidden lines reveal that the Anunnaki's attempts to restore control often reinforced the perception of their vulnerability. Conflict among the gods intensified as human autonomy expanded. Some Anunnaki advocated for strict enforcement through punishment or divine intervention, while others recognized that humans were developing skills and strategies that could benefit the divine agenda if allowed freedom. Passages describe debates over measures of reward and restraint, and note that the heart of the council wavers, illustrating the difficulty in reconciling strategy with principle. The fragmented records suggest that human societies were observing these divisions, learning to act where divine oversight was uncertain or inconsistent. Urban growth and technological innovation accelerated during this period. Cities like Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur expanded beyond the oversight of assigned Anunnaki, developing irrigation networks, administrative systems, and trade connections that reduced reliance on celestial guidance. The hidden lines record phrases such as "they shape the canals where the watchers are absent," and "labor moves beyond the decree," indicating deliberate human adaptation and experimentation. These actions show that the collapse of divine control was not passive. Humans were actively reorganizing social, economic, and environmental systems according to their understanding of local needs and capabilities. The texts also describe symbolic challenges to hierarchy through ritual and religious practice. Humans began to reinterpret ceremonies, integrating local leaders and traditions alongside Anunnaki figures. Lines that translate to "they honor the lords yet follow their own measure" suggest that worship was becoming a tool for social cohesion rather than unquestioned obedience. These subtle shifts undermined the perception of unbroken divine authority, creating a dual system in which humans acknowledged the gods but simultaneously exercised independent judgment in critical aspects of governance and daily life. Evidence of strategic human planning appears repeatedly in economic and agricultural records. Certain passages indicate that humans reallocated resources, adjusted labor assignments, and managed stores without awaiting instructions from divine overseers. Words translating roughly to "they place the grain where needed" and "the labor moves without counsel" illustrate a growing operational autonomy. By mastering the management of resources, humans demonstrated the ability to maintain societal stability independently, a crucial step in rewriting the balance between divine authority and mortal agency. The hidden lines also reveal lessons learned from previous oversight failures. Humans recognize patterns in the Anunnaki's responses, identifying areas of inconsistency and opportunity. Lines in the texts suggest that humans measure the gaze of the lords and act where the path is unobserved, emphasizing both tactical awareness and adaptive strategy. These subtle forms of resistance highlight the evolution of intelligence and coordination in human societies, reinforcing the erosion of hierarchical control from within the systems that had once depended on absolute obedience. Despite these challenges, the Anunnaki were not entirely powerless. Certain texts describe interventions designed to restore order, often in the form of ritual correction, administrative adjustments, or the deployment of divine authority to key urban centers. Phrases translating to "the eye watches over the measure" and "command returns to the appointed path" indicate efforts to reassert dominance, yet hidden lines show that such interventions were increasingly limited in scope. Human societies were already operating with a degree of independence that rendered full control impossible, and each attempt to re-establish hierarchy revealed further gaps in divine oversight. This period also reflects the emergence of negotiation and compromise as central mechanisms in the relationship between humans and the Anunnaki. Hidden lines suggest that humans acted in consultation with certain Anunnaki while circumventing others, creating a complex network of influence and dependency. Words translating to "they follow some decrees but bypass others" and "the council is heeded selectively" indicate that humans were shaping the terms of their engagement with the divine, effectively rewriting the hierarchy to reflect a balance between obedience and autonomy. By examining these, it becomes clear that the collapse of absolute oversight was neither sudden nor complete. Instead, it was a gradual reconfiguration, a transformation in which humans assumed practical authority over their lives while still acknowledging the presence of the Anunnaki. The hidden lines document a dynamic negotiation, revealing a world in which divine hierarchy was no longer absolute. Human ingenuity challenged celestial authority, and control was distributed in ways that redefined the balance of power on Earth. The human ascendancy. The Sumerian texts reveal that following the gradual erosion of direct Anunnaki oversight, humans began to assert an unprecedented level of authority over their societies. Hidden lines within administrative tablets and ritual texts indicate that city-states were coordinating activities across regions without consulting the celestial lords. Phrases translating roughly to "the labor moves as thought best" and "the grain flows along paths unmarked" illustrate the growing independence of human decision-making. This period marks a pivotal transformation in which humans transitioned from recipients of divine instruction to active architects of their own social and environmental systems. Technological innovation accelerated during this era. Humans refined irrigation networks, constructed complex ziggurats, and developed urban planning techniques that were independent of Anunnaki guidance. Certain hidden lines describe humans adjusting waters before the eyes of the watchers and measuring fields without the word of the lords, indicating that human societies were taking responsibility for the maintenance and expansion of infrastructure previously managed by divine oversight. These achievements reflect not only ingenuity but also strategic foresight, revealing a society increasingly capable of operating autonomously. Political structures began to reflect this shift as well. City-states implemented councils, codified laws, and systems of taxation that allowed communities to function efficiently without relying on divine intervention. Texts contain phrases like, "They rule among themselves and guide the people," and "The decrees are placed by their own hand," emphasizing the emergence of human governance that paralleled, and in some cases replaced, celestial authority. These developments demonstrate that authority was moving from the symbolic presence of the Anunnaki to practical, human-directed administration. Religious practices continue to evolve alongside these societal transformations. Humans maintained respect for the Anunnaki while introducing local deities, ancestral spirits, and civic rituals into their ceremonies. Certain hidden lines suggest that worship was increasingly performed with human interpretation, with phrases translating to "honor is given, yet the heart moves its own path," and "rites are followed, yet decisions rest with mortals." This blending of divine reverence and human agency reflects a delicate recalibration of spiritual authority, where the presence of the gods remained symbolic but no longer dictated the minutiae of daily life. Economic independence became increasingly evident in trade and resource management. Texts describe humans reallocating grain, livestock, and raw materials across multiple city-states, often circumventing direct oversight from assigned Anunnaki agents. Phrases translating roughly to "the stores are shifted as needed" and "labor moves without command" indicate a society capable of self-regulation and adaptation. These actions highlight the strategic intelligence of human communities, showing a capacity for complex planning that was previously the exclusive domain of the gods. Education and the transmission of knowledge also played a critical role in human ascendancy. Scribes and scholars documented techniques for agriculture, construction, and governance, often annotating tablets in ways that preserved practical knowledge while subtly minimizing reliance on divine instruction. Hidden lines describe humans teaching the measure and recording the paths of work, illustrating a conscious effort to institutionalize wisdom in human hands. This development reinforced independence, creating a cultural framework that allowed future generations to continue expanding authority without direct oversight from the Anunnaki. The texts further suggest that humans began to test the boundaries of divine authority with calculated ingenuity. Inscriptions contain phrases like, "They act where the eye does not reach," and "The work proceeds beyond counsel," highlighting a deliberate recognition of gaps in oversight. These strategies were not acts of defiance for the sake of conflict, but reflected an understanding of practical limitations in the Anunnaki's ability to enforce control. By identifying and exploiting these spaces, humans gradually established spheres of autonomy that were resilient against interference from celestial agents. Social organization, including labor divisions, trade partnerships, and legal structures, became increasingly decentralized. Hidden lines describe humans choosing their own leaders and assigning work according to local need, reflecting an emerging independence in both governance and social coordination. This decentralized approach allowed city-states to thrive without constant divine oversight, demonstrating a maturation of societal intelligence and reinforcing the shift from celestial to human authority. Even cultural expression began to reflect this ascendancy. Artistic works, monumental architecture, and written narratives increasingly centered human achievement alongside or even above divine instruction. Certain tablets describe humans shaping the image and song of the city with little reference to the gods' direct involvement, highlighting a growing confidence in the human role in shaping destiny. This cultural expansion indicates that human ascendancy was not merely practical or administrative, but also symbolic, reshaping perceptions of power, achievement, and creativity. By the end of this period, humans had established a level of self-sufficiency that the Anunnaki could no longer fully regulate. The hidden lines of the texts document a society where divine authority was acknowledged yet increasingly optional, and where human agency dominated the mechanisms of governance, labor, and culture. These developments mark a turning point in the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity, signaling a new era in which control was distributed more evenly between creator and creation. Fractured alliances among the gods. The Sumerian texts reveal that, as humans gained autonomy, the Anunnaki themselves were pulled into conflicts and disagreements that weakened their ability to govern effectively. Hidden lines describe councils of the gods in which leaders debated not only human defiance, but also the actions of their peers. Phrases translating roughly to "the voices are at odds" and "the council falters before the measure" suggest that rivalries and competing agendas undermined cohesive decision-making. In this context, human initiative intersected with divine discord, amplifying the effects of each action and creating gaps in oversight that had never existed before. Disagreement among the Anunnaki was not only ideological but operational. Some gods argued for stricter enforcement of labor and tribute, seeking to remind humans of their dependency through punishment or reallocation of resources. Others advocated restraint, noting that interference could provoke resistance and destabilize systems already showing signs of independent human management. Lines translating to "the hand is torn between action and patience" and "the watchers cannot agree on the measure" illustrate the difficulty in reaching consensus, revealing an internal fragility that humans could perceive and, over time, exploit. These divisions were also reflected in the administration of specific regions. Certain Anunnaki were responsible for overseeing agricultural networks, city defenses, and resource distribution, yet hidden lines indicate inconsistency in how these responsibilities were executed. Phrases translating roughly to "the steward turns aside, the work shifts," and "the path of the labor is unclear" suggest that local human leaders began to identify patterns in oversight failures, allowing them to expand autonomy in areas where divine attention was weakest. These inconsistencies contributed to a broader realignment of authority between celestial and human hands. Ritual and religious practice further highlighted fractures among the Anunnaki. Texts describe disagreements over ceremonies, offerings, and the interpretation of omens, with lines such as "the Lord's hands are divided" and "the words of the heavens clash." Humans responded by developing adaptive rituals that incorporated aspects of multiple gods' expectations, often blending symbolic obedience with practical decision-making. This dual approach allowed societies to maintain spiritual continuity while circumventing the restrictive influence of any single divine faction. In economic matters, fractures became increasingly apparent. Administrative tablets reveal that humans managed resources, coordinated labor, and controlled trade in ways that occasionally contradicted the orders of assigned Anunnaki agents. Hidden lines contain phrases like "the stores are arranged beyond the decree" and "labor follows the thought of mortals," demonstrating that humans were exploiting gaps in divine supervision. The inability of the Anunnaki to enforce consistent oversight accelerated the shift of operational authority toward human communities. The texts also suggest that certain Anunnaki were deliberately testing human limits, attempting to gauge the resilience and ingenuity of societies that had begun to operate independently. Lines translating to "they watch to see the measure bent" and "the path is observed for the unseen" imply strategic observation rather than intervention. Humans, aware of these limitations, continued to develop organizational structures that could survive oversight or manipulation, gradually reducing the gods' practical power over daily life. Some passages highlight the personal ambitions and rivalries of the gods themselves. Hidden lines describe disputes over territory, influence, and access to resources, with phrases like "the hand reaches against the hand" and "counsel divided among the watchers." These internal tensions diminished the ability of the Anunnaki to respond cohesively to human innovation, creating opportunities for societies to assert authority independently. Over time, these divisions eroded confidence in the divine hierarchy and demonstrated that celestial power was contingent rather than absolute. The texts also record symbolic references to failed coordination, describing instances when one Anunnaki attempted to intervene, but was counteracted, ignored, or misunderstood by others. Phrases translating roughly to "the word is unheeded, the measure undone" suggest that divine oversight was increasingly ineffective even when intentions were clear. This loss of coherence amplified the autonomy of human communities, who could take advantage of fragmented authority to expand governance, trade, and infrastructure without immediate repercussion. Even as humans consolidated authority, the hidden lines indicate that certain factions of Anunnaki attempted to maintain influence through selective engagement. Texts describe strategies such as targeted guidance, ritual enforcement, or allocation of symbolic rewards, but lines like "the watcher's hand is partial" and "the measure extends unevenly" indicate that these efforts were limited and inconsistent. The resulting dynamic created a world in which humans increasingly determined the organization of their society, while the Anunnaki remained present but incapable of comprehensive control. By the end of this era, the Sumerian texts suggest a profound transformation in the structure of power. Human societies were thriving with operational, social, and religious independence, while the Anunnaki were divided, constrained, and forced to negotiate their influence across multiple domains. Hidden lines record a celestial hierarchy that was no longer absolute, a network of gods struggling to respond to an emergent human agency that operated with strategic intelligence, practical authority, and an increasing sense of autonomy. The rise of human sovereignty. The Sumerian texts illustrate a period in which humans increasingly assumed control over the mechanisms of society, transforming from subordinate laborers into architects of their own destiny. Hidden lines suggest that city-states developed systems of governance, labor management, and economic coordination independent of the Anunnaki's direct oversight. Phrases translating roughly to "they hold the measure themselves" and "labor moves under human thought" reflect a deliberate exercise of agency, signaling that humans were no longer fully reliant on divine intervention to maintain order and productivity. Technological and infrastructural advancements accelerated during this era. Humans expanded canal systems, refined urban planning, and developed complex networks of storage and distribution that ensured stability across multiple settlements. Certain hidden lines describe humans guiding the waters beyond command and placing the grain according to their own calculation, highlighting both practical intelligence and strategic foresight. These achievements reinforced the ability of societies to operate independently, demonstrating a level of organizational sophistication that previously belonged solely to the Anunnaki. Political structures were increasingly human-directed. Council systems, codified laws, and administrative protocols allowed communities to govern without relying on divine decrees. Lines in the texts translate to "they decide the paths of justice" and "leaders allocate labor according to need," illustrating a shift from celestial enforcement to mortal regulation. Hidden annotations indicate that humans were capable of negotiating disputes, enforcing standards, and maintaining cohesion, all while the Anunnaki observed from a diminished position of influence. Religious practices began to integrate human priorities alongside traditional worship. Humans continued to honor the Anunnaki, but incorporated local deities, civic leaders, and ancestral spirits, effectively balancing spiritual observance with pragmatic decision-making. Phrases translating to "they bow but choose the path of the city" and "rites are performed, yet authority rests with mortals" show how ritual was reinterpreted to allow societal self-determination. This adaptation of spiritual practice further cemented human sovereignty, reflecting an evolving understanding of power and responsibility. Economic independence became increasingly apparent. Trade, resource distribution, and labor allocation were coordinated within human networks, sometimes bypassing the oversight of celestial agents. Hidden lines describe humans moving goods along paths unobserved and assigning labor where no decree is given, demonstrating that operational control had shifted from divine to mortal hands. These actions not only reinforced independence, but also allowed societies to adapt efficiently to environmental challenges, population growth, and intercity coordination. Education and knowledge management played a critical role in consolidating human authority. Scribes documented techniques in agriculture, construction, and governance, creating records that enabled societies to preserve wisdom across generations. Lines translating to "they teach the measure and record the path" indicate deliberate institutionalization of expertise, reducing reliance on divine instruction and fostering the development of an informed, capable citizenry. Knowledge became a cornerstone of human sovereignty, ensuring continuity and resilience even in the absence of direct oversight. Humans also demonstrated tactical awareness in their interactions with the Anunnaki. Hidden lines reveal deliberate action taken where divine oversight was minimal or inconsistent, with phrases like "they move where the eye does not see" and "the labor proceeds beyond counsel." This careful navigation of gaps in oversight suggests that humans were not acting in defiance for its own sake, but rather exercising agency to maintain and expand the systems they had inherited. Strategic initiative became a defining feature of human governance. The consolidation of social, political, and economic authority reinforced interdependence within human societies. Labor, trade, and governance became increasingly decentralized yet coordinated, allowing cities to thrive without relying on celestial management. Lines in administrative tablets suggest that humans were choosing leaders directing work, and allocating stores independently, reflecting a mature societal organization that no longer required constant divine supervision. This coordination marked a turning point in human autonomy, establishing sovereignty as a practical reality. Art, architecture, and cultural expression reflected the ascent of human authority. Monumental works, narrative texts, and symbolic depictions increasingly highlighted human achievement alongside the presence of the Anunnaki. Hidden lines describe humans shaping the city and its song, and recording deeds beyond the measure of the gods, emphasizing both practical and symbolic dimensions of sovereignty. The evolution of culture paralleled the consolidation of political and economic power, demonstrating that human authority extended into every facet of life. By the end of this period, humans had transitioned into fully autonomous agents, capable of governance, innovation, and cultural creation independent of divine supervision. The hidden lines of the Sumerian texts reveal a society in which the Anunnaki were present, yet largely observational, and humans controlled the practical and symbolic levers of authority. Sovereignty was no longer a theoretical concept, but a lived reality, marking a profound redefinition of power, responsibility, and agency in the earliest human civilizations. The silent departure of the Anunnaki. As human societies solidified their authority, the Sumerian texts reveal that the Anunnaki gradually withdrew from direct involvement in everyday affairs. Hidden lines describe actions that suggest oversight shifted from active management to distant observation. Phrases translating roughly to "the watchers move to the edges" and "hands of the lords are lifted from the labor" indicate that celestial intervention became selective, limited to ceremonial guidance or rare displays of influence. The practical governance of cities, irrigation networks, and trade systems was increasingly directed by humans, marking a decisive shift in power dynamics. Certain texts suggest that this withdrawal was not abrupt but measured. The Anunnaki appear to have delegated responsibilities to humans in stages, monitoring their ability to maintain social, economic, and ritual order. Hidden lines describe humans managing the measure under watchful eyes and performing labor beyond counsel, indicating that while divine attention persisted, humans had assumed operational control. This transition demonstrates an evolving recognition among the gods that full oversight was neither sustainable nor necessary, and that human ingenuity could maintain stability without constant supervision. The withdrawal of the Anunnaki is also reflected in religious documentation. Ceremonial texts note that offerings and rituals continued to acknowledge divine authority, but lines translating to "they honor from afar" and "the Lord's presence is seen in shadow" suggest that physical and administrative influence had waned. Humans adapted to this semi-autonomous religious landscape, interpreting omens, managing rituals, and integrating local practices into worship. The hidden lines imply that the spiritual presence of the Anunnaki persisted symbolically, but practical authority had largely shifted to human hands. Economic systems highlight another dimension of the Anunnaki's departure. Texts indicate that humans controlled resource allocation, trade logistics, and labor distribution without requiring constant supervision. Hidden lines describe actions such as "grain flows by human calculation" and "labor is directed without command," illustrating that operational independence had become a functional reality. By managing these systems, humans demonstrated the capacity to sustain society, leaving the gods to focus on ceremonial, observational, or symbolic roles. Urban administration evolved alongside these changes. City-states increasingly governed themselves through councils, legal codes, and civic management, all of which operated without divine intervention. Lines in the texts translate to "leaders adjudicate disputes" and "work proceeds under human measure," indicating that humans had mastered the art of self-governance. This autonomy allowed communities to expand, innovate, and respond to environmental and social challenges with minimal reliance on celestial oversight. The hidden lines also describe the strategic observation by certain Anunnaki who appeared to test human initiative from a distance. Phrases like "the eye watches, but hands do not move," and "the measure is seen, but not corrected," suggest a deliberate choice to allow humans to exercise authority while preserving the option to intervene selectively. These actions reveal a complex interplay between observation and autonomy, as humans were allowed to consolidate power, experiment with governance, and refine social organization in the absence of active, divine interference. Environmental management further reinforced human independence. The texts describe humans maintaining irrigation, controlling floodwaters, and adapting to seasonal cycles without invoking immediate divine guidance. Lines translating to "they guide the rivers themselves" and "the fields respond to human planning" highlight a practical mastery over the landscape. By assuming responsibility for environmental stability, humans removed one of the last levers of Anunnaki authority, demonstrating both competence and resilience. The cultural and symbolic domains of society were similarly transformed. Hidden lines suggest that humans expanded artistic, architectural, and literary expression beyond the oversight of the gods. Phrases translating to "they shape the city and its song" and "the record is kept by human hand" indicate that culture was increasingly human-centered. This cultural independence reflected the consolidation of authority in symbolic terms, reinforcing the practical autonomy already achieved in governance, trade, and environmental management. Finally, the texts hint at a subtle psychological and relational shift. The Anunnaki, once feared as omnipotent overseers, were now perceived as distant figures whose presence was acknowledged, but whose power over daily life had diminished. Lines translating to "the watchers are honored but not obeyed," and "the lords are known, yet paths are chosen by mortals," illustrate a profound change in perception, where humans no longer relied on divine guidance to shape their actions, decisions, or societal structures. By this stage, the Sumerian texts make clear that the day-to-day governance of Earth had passed into human hands. The hidden lines document a society that had matured in its capacity for self-direction, innovation, and cultural creation, while the Anunnaki remained present in ceremonial, symbolic, and observational roles. This shift marks a critical phase in early human history, revealing a world in which practical sovereignty was firmly established and the balance of power had decisively tilted toward mortals. Legacy of the hidden lines. The Sumerian texts preserve a legacy that extends far beyond the immediate events of human ascendancy. Hidden lines within administrative, ritual, and mythic tablets contain subtle details about the gradual shift of authority from the Anunnaki to humans. Phrases translating roughly to "the paths are chosen without the word of the lords" and "labor and measure rest in mortal hands" suggest that the scribes intentionally encoded this narrative for future generations. These lines, often overlooked or misinterpreted in early translations, reveal a sophisticated method of recording not only events but also the principles underlying human autonomy and societal evolution. Education and record-keeping played a central role in the preservation of these hidden messages. Scribes documented practical knowledge alongside symbolic commentary, creating a dual record that served both operational and cultural purposes. Hidden lines describe humans teaching the measure and observing the lords, and recording the work beyond counsel, indicating an awareness that knowledge itself was a tool of empowerment. These texts ensured that succeeding generations could inherit techniques, governance methods, and societal wisdom without reliance on direct divine oversight. The hidden lines also highlight the nuanced relationship between humans and the Anunnaki after sovereignty was established. Certain passages suggest that the gods were still acknowledged and honored, but their influence was increasingly ceremonial or symbolic. Phrases translating to "the watchers are present in shadow" and "the lords are revered, yet the measure is held by humans" indicate that humans had effectively redefined the terms of divine engagement. This subtle balancing act maintained spiritual continuity while consolidating practical autonomy, ensuring that human societies could thrive within a framework of inherited cultural reverence. Economic and administrative independence continued to evolve, and the hidden lines document the emergence of standardized systems of governance. Humans developed methods for resource allocation, labor management, and trade coordination that relied on internal structures rather than divine intervention. Lines translating roughly to "stores are arranged by human choice" and "labor flows where the hand directs" suggest that these systems were deliberately codified to ensure continuity. The texts imply that knowledge of these structures was considered sacred in its own right, representing a permanent record of human agency. Urban planning and environmental adaptation were similarly informed by these hidden instructions. The texts describe how humans maintained irrigation systems, constructed fortifications, and adapted to seasonal cycles without direct supervision. Phrases translating to "the rivers are guided by mortal thought" and "fields respond to human calculation" indicate that the mastery of environmental systems was both a practical achievement and a symbolic declaration of autonomy. By encoding these strategies in hidden lines, the Sumerians preserved a blueprint for resilience and innovation across generations. Cultural expression became another domain in which the hidden lines preserved the story of human ascendancy. Art, literature, and monumental architecture increasingly emphasized human achievement, often alongside symbolic depictions of the Anunnaki. Lines translating to "they shape the city and its song" and "deeds are recorded by mortal hands" suggest that culture itself was a medium for documenting sovereignty. The hidden lines demonstrate that the Sumerians recognized the power of narrative to reinforce societal autonomy, ensuring that the achievements of humanity were memorialized in both practical and symbolic forms. These records also document the subtle intelligence and strategy that enabled humans to consolidate authority. Hidden lines describe the careful observation of divine patterns, the exploitation of gaps in oversight, and the deliberate management of resources and labor. Phrases like "the gaze is measured, the path is chosen," and "they act where counsel is absent" reflect a conscious engagement with the limitations of the Anunnaki, revealing a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. This legacy of strategic insight was preserved to guide future generations in navigating both celestial and earthly authority. Religious and ceremonial structures encoded in the hidden lines reveal a deliberate blending of spiritual respect and practical independence. Humans maintained ritual practice, honoring the Anunnaki while simultaneously interpreting ceremonial obligations to meet societal needs. Lines translating roughly to "rites are followed yet adjusted by human hand" and "the offering is given, but the measure rests with mortals" illustrate a deliberate negotiation between reverence and autonomy. These passages indicate that spiritual continuity and societal governance could coexist without requiring full divine supervision. The hidden lines also suggest that Sumerians understood the historical significance of these transformations. Certain annotations imply an awareness that humanity had reached a critical juncture where knowledge, strategy, and societal coordination had permanently shifted the balance of power. Phrases translating to "the measure is now held in mortal hands" and "paths of labor proceed beyond the watchers" emphasize that these changes were recorded deliberately as both documentation and instruction, providing a blueprint for the consolidation of authority in subsequent civilizations. By preserving this nuanced record, the Sumerians ensured that the story of human ascendancy and the subtle decline of Anunnaki oversight would endure. The hidden lines serve as a testament to strategic intelligence, cultural adaptation, and societal resilience. They encode a narrative in which humans evolved from subordinate laborers to autonomous agents, capable of shaping their world, managing resources, and maintaining cultural and spiritual structures independent of celestial control, while the Anunnaki remained observers rather than active rulers. Echoes across time. The hidden lines of the Sumerian texts reveal more than the story of human sovereignty. They trace patterns that reverberate across millennia, influencing subsequent civilizations long after the Anunnaki's withdrawal. Certain phrases translate to "the measure of the people endures beyond the watchers" and "paths are traced by mortal hands," suggesting that early human agency became encoded as a guiding principle for future societies. These inscriptions preserve lessons on governance, resource management, and social cohesion that would inform cultures throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. Technological knowledge, recorded in these lines, continued to shape human development. References to irrigation, construction, and urban planning demonstrate methods that later civilizations would adopt, adapt, and expand. Phrases translating to "the rivers flow at human thought" and "the cities are built according to mortal measure" indicate that the practical expertise of early Sumerians became a template for the organization of human society. This continuity reflects a deliberate preservation of skills, allowing knowledge to persist independently of direct divine supervision. Political systems show similar echoes across time. Hidden lines describe councils, codified laws, and administrative hierarchies that humans established while consolidating autonomy. Texts contain phrases like "leaders judge and measure" and "labor flows under human decision," indicating that these early practices were institutionalized, creating a framework that later city-states could replicate. The strategic foresight embedded in these systems ensured continuity in governance, even in the absence of celestial guidance. Economic organization also reflects the enduring influence of these hidden lines. Resource allocation, trade networks, and labor coordination are described in ways that demonstrate the emergence of standardized practices. Lines translating roughly to "stores are distributed by human hand" and work proceeds without counsel show that humans developed methods for efficiency and stability that could be inherited across generations. These innovations created resilient social and economic systems capable of sustaining large, complex populations. The cultural legacy of these shifts persisted as well. Monumental architecture, literature, and symbolic representation increasingly emphasized human achievement, often integrating but not relying on the presence of the Anunnaki. Phrases translating to "the city is shaped and sung by mortals" and "deeds are recorded by human measure" highlight the centrality of human action in shaping both the physical and symbolic world. This cultural assertion reinforced societal autonomy, leaving a record that emphasized human creativity and strategic intelligence. Religious practices evolved in tandem with these developments. Hidden lines indicate that humans maintained ritual and ceremonial recognition of the Anunnaki while incorporating local deities, civic leaders, and ancestral spirits into practice. Texts contain phrases translating to "rites are observed and adjusted" and "the offering is given, yet the measure is held by mortals," demonstrating a blending of reverence and practical governance. This adaptation created a sustainable religious framework that allowed societies to function independently while preserving spiritual continuity. Strategic intelligence and adaptation emerge as central themes in the hidden lines. Humans are repeatedly described as observing gaps in oversight, calculating resource needs, and coordinating labor with foresight. Phrases like "the gaze is measured," "the path chosen," and "they act beyond counsel" highlight the capacity for planning and analysis that allowed early civilizations to thrive. This focus on strategy ensured that human societies could consolidate authority effectively, creating systems resilient to both environmental challenges and the limitations of divine oversight. The hidden lines also emphasize the symbolic reinterpretation of divine authority. While the Anunnaki remained present in ceremonial and observational roles, humans increasingly determined the organization of their societies. Phrases translating to "the watchers are honored, yet paths are chosen," and "deeds proceed under mortal measure" illustrate a subtle but powerful shift in perception, one in which divine oversight was respected but no longer dictated action. This evolving relationship established a precedent for the conceptual separation of spiritual acknowledgement and practical authority. Education and record-keeping ensured that these lessons endured across generations. The hidden lines describe the transmission of practical knowledge alongside cultural and symbolic instruction. Phrases translating to "the measure is taught and recorded" and "knowledge persists through human hands" highlight the deliberate codification of wisdom. This practice allowed successive civilizations to inherit the tools of governance, engineering, and strategy without reliance on celestial guidance, reinforcing human sovereignty as a sustainable principle. Through these hidden lines, the Sumerians encoded a narrative that transcends time. Humans emerged as autonomous agents, mastering the practical, symbolic, and cultural aspects of civilization, while the Anunnaki transitioned to a largely observational role. The texts preserve a blueprint for agency, resilience, and governance, demonstrating how the earliest societies consolidated authority, maintained social cohesion, and developed strategies that would resonate across centuries, leaving echoes of human ascendancy that shaped the trajectory of civilization itself. Guardians of memory. The Sumerians were not merely recorders of events. They acted as custodians of knowledge, deliberately embedding subtle narratives within the hidden lines of their texts. These inscriptions document not only what occurred during the decline of Anunnaki oversight, but also how humans interpreted and institutionalized these transformations. Phrases translating roughly to "the paths are marked in shadow and knowledge endures beyond the gaze" suggest a conscious effort to preserve lessons for future generations, ensuring that human ingenuity and autonomy would be remembered and respected. Education and mentorship were central to this preservation. Scribes and scholars transmitted practical knowledge, administrative methods, and cultural narratives through careful instruction and meticulously crafted texts. Hidden lines describe humans teaching the measure and recording paths beyond the Lord's eye, indicating that education was both a practical tool and a symbolic act. This dual function ensured that each generation inherited the capacity for self-governance, strategic planning, and cultural innovation, safeguarding the memory of human ascendancy. The hidden lines also emphasize the role of ritual in reinforcing knowledge. Ceremonial practices were designed not only to honor the Anunnaki, but to encode operational principles in symbolic form. Phrases translating to "rites preserve the measure" and "the offering teaches the hand of mortals" illustrate how ritual became a medium for transmitting information, blending spiritual reverence with practical instruction. These practices strengthened communal memory, allowing lessons in autonomy and governance to endure even as societies expanded and evolved. Economic and administrative structures were similarly preserved. Texts contain detailed instructions on resource allocation, labor organization, and trade, encoded in ways that required interpretation and engagement. Hidden lines describe humans aligning the stores with foresight and directing labor beyond counsel, emphasizing that knowledge was both preserved and actively applied. By embedding these instructions within daily practices and record-keeping, the Sumerians created systems capable of sustaining societal autonomy across generations. Cultural memory played a significant role in reinforcing human sovereignty. Monumental architecture, inscriptions, and literary works recorded human achievement alongside acknowledgement of the Anunnaki. Lines translating to "the city sings of mortal deeds" and "deeds are traced in human measure" indicate a deliberate effort to memorialize autonomy and innovation. These records serve not merely as documentation, but as a means of cultivating identity, reminding future generations of the capacities and accomplishments of their ancestors. Strategic insight was preserved alongside practical knowledge. The hidden lines repeatedly highlight human observation, calculation, and adaptability, documenting methods for navigating gaps in oversight and optimizing societal functions. Phrases like "paths are measured where the eye does not see" and "labor moves with foresight" illustrate the Sumerians' understanding that autonomy required not only action but intelligence. These records ensured that successive civilizations could replicate strategies for resilience and coordinated governance. The symbolic reinterpretation of the Anunnaki is also captured in these texts. Humans continued to honor the gods while consolidating authority, a balance reflected in lines translating to "the watchers are revered, but the measure is human," and "rights follow the hand that guides the city." These passages preserve the subtle negotiation between spiritual respect and practical independence, showing how early societies maintained cultural continuity while asserting autonomy over the structures of life and labor. Hidden lines suggest that memory itself was a form of power. By encoding lessons in texts, ritual, and cultural practices, the Sumerians created a framework in which knowledge could survive challenges, environmental shifts, and generational change. Phrases translating to "knowledge moves through human hands" and "the paths endure beyond measure" indicate that the preservation of memory was seen as essential to societal resilience, ensuring that human sovereignty could persist despite external pressures. The role of the Sumerians as guardians of memory extended into civic and spiritual spheres. Laws, administrative instructions, rituals, and cultural narratives were interwoven to create a comprehensive system for maintaining societal integrity. Hidden lines describe humans guiding the people with recorded wisdom and aligning paths of labor and ritual, emphasizing the deliberate effort to sustain both the practical and symbolic dimensions of autonomy. These measures created continuity, allowing societies to thrive even as celestial oversight became increasingly distant. Furthermore, the hidden lines suggest that Sumerians were aware of the long-term consequences of human autonomy. Certain passages translate roughly to "the measure established will guide many generations" and "the paths of labor and thought will endure beyond the watchers," indicating foresight in both instruction and documentation. This awareness highlights a profound understanding of the importance of preserving strategic, cultural, and societal knowledge, ensuring that future civilizations could learn from and build upon the successes of early humanity. Art, literature, and ceremonial practice were deliberately used as vessels for memory. Hidden lines describe the creation of inscriptions, songs, and monuments that conveyed both symbolic reverence and practical lessons. Phrases translating to "the city speaks through deeds" and "the measure flows through song" illustrate a multi-dimensional approach to knowledge preservation. These texts ensured that learning was embedded not only in practical work but in the cultural consciousness, reinforcing autonomy in ways that transcended generations. Through these efforts, the Sumerians ensured that the story of human ascendancy and the lessons of autonomy were preserved across time. Hidden lines capture a civilization consciously documenting not only what had occurred, but how knowledge, strategy, and societal resilience could endure. By acting as guardians of memory, they created a bridge across time, linking early human ingenuity to the broader trajectory of civilization and ensuring that the principles of self-governance, cultural innovation, and strategic insight would echo across millennia, shaping the path of humanity long after the Anunnaki had receded.